Before I begin this week's episode, I would like to apologize for launching this week's episode on Friday instead of Wednesday when I've been normally launching. Just to let everyone know right now, I'm going to be launching new episodes on Fridays throughout the month of February. I would like to experiment with launch dates, but I do promise that I will adhere to a weekly schedule, and if anything changes, I will let you, the listeners, know if said changes. With all that said, let's get right into this week's episode of MetrObelisk Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are taking a look at The Dark Crystal. This is going to be the first movie retrospective to use my new rating system that will be in place going forward from this point onward. In looking at The Dark Crystal, we need to ask ourselves, is this the type of movie to stand the test of time? Is this the type of movie that you can watch at any age, or do you have to be younger in order to like it? As is the case like all the other retrospectives, first we're going to start by taking a look at the creative team, then move into looking at the aesthetics of the movie, then talking about the story and plot, followed by a character analysis. Then we're going to discuss whether this movie is rewatchable or not, and then we'll give a final review score on a 1 to 10 point scale. Taking a look at the creative team, the story was written by Jim Henson. This was his personal project at the time, and in order to get this made, he had to agree to do a sequel to the Muppet movie, and that's how The Great Muppet Caper was made. The actual script itself was written by David Odell, who worked as a writer on The Muppet Show from 1979 to 1981. He was a writer for 48 episodes. And this was directed by both Jim Henson and Frank Oz. Frank Oz being a collaborator with Jim Henson on The Muppet Show, being the voice of Fozzie Bear, Miss Piggy, Animal, just to name a few. Not only being the voices, but also as a puppeteer. This is also Frank Oz's directorial debut. Now moving on to the first judged portion of this retrospective is the aesthetics of the film. This is a puppet movie with various races of creatures throughout. So we have the Gelflings, who is a race of creatures that is not really known because the vast majority were wiped out, leaving only Jen and Kira as far as this movie is concerned. Then you have the Skeksis, which is a violent race of creatures that inhabit the castle of the Dark Crystal. They are a vulture-like species who cannot fly. This is the race that wiped out the Gelflings because of a prophecy proving them to be a very selfish race. On the opposite side of the Skeksis, you have the Mystics, who are a peaceful race who value knowledge and religion. They take in Jen and teach them their ways, proving to be a very selfless race of creatures. And the final race of creatures I want to talk about are the Podlings. Basically, these guys look a lot like the Doozers from Fraggle Rock, just without the hard hats. They live in the forest / the trees, also live off the land. As far as what's shown in the movie, they're a very egalitarian race. There are very distinct locales from the caves of the Mystics, the Skeksis Castle where the Dark Crystal is, Augra's Observatory, Kira's Swamp, the home of the Podlings, and even the ruins of a Gelfling temple shown throughout this movie. This movie has a very strong mythology to it that actually makes sense. So, in a nutshell, there was a godlike race that shattered the Dark Crystal, and it created two new races out of it, the Skeksis and the Mystics. 1,000 years go by, and both are down to just 10 members left of their races, respectively. The Dark Crystal needs to be repaired on the day of the convergence, that's the three suns aligning, to restore the godlike race, or the Skeksis will transcend and take over the universe. Traditions and language are very prevalent throughout this movie. With regards to the Skeksis, if two people wanted to become the Emperor, it went down to a trial by stone. Both Skeksis would take their swords and swing it at a stone trying to cut through it. The winner becomes Emperor and the loser is banished forever. There's even an economy built on slavery in the movie created by the Skeksis by using the Podlings to essentially upkeep their empire, adding to the great world building with distinct locales, mythology, tradition, language, and economics all shown within the span of about 90 minutes. Now, this movie is all practical effects or done through the camera, given that this is a puppet movie and it was made in the early 1980s, 1983 to be more exact. As a result, the effects don't really hold up by modern standards, as practical effects have gotten better over time, and CGI is used more to do what practical effects can't do. Now moving into more of the criticisms of the aesthetics, one of my big ones is the editing. Some shots go on for a little too long before the angle is either changed or there is a new sequence. With regards to sequences and story, that was the standard back then to drag something out. I think it works for the better with regards to the Dark Crystal because you get to see the visuals more and there's always something going on in the background to make it look like a living world. So adding on to that, there are some shots of puppets or puppets riding men in costumes as transition shots going from one location to the next. There's one sequence where they show Jen, Kira, and Fizzgig riding on these men in costumes, basically the horses of the world to Gelflings, and it goes on for a little too long, showing the joys of riding these things. You could cut about 90% of the sequence out, and it will not affect the movie in any way. I personally would have rather seen just Jim Henson do like a wipe like you see in the original Star Wars to cover up that transition. With regards to cinematography and angle changes, this can be forgiven since this was a puppet movie and the sets had to be built to accommodate for that decision. Simply put, Jim Henson and Oswald Morris, who was the cinematographer of this movie, had to work within the limitations. And finally, for those who are going to ask with regards to music, in my opinion, there really isn't a memorable piece of it from this movie. If the music doesn't stick out to me, then I'll simply forget it and move on. So my final overall score of the aesthetics is an 8.5 out of 10. So with the aesthetics of the movie out of the way, now we're going to move into the actual story and plot of the movie. Essentially, it is a hero's journey. It's Jen's journey to repair the Dark Crystal to restore the balance and beauty of the world. He runs into problems along the way, such as the Skeksis trying to capture and kill him at Auger's observatory, meeting Kira in the swamp, the Podlings being raided, and almost being killed by Chamberlain. In the end, he repairs the Dark Crystal, the Skeksis and Mystics become one again, and the beauty is being restored to the world. The only real complaint that I have in this department is Kira's death. She died by throwing the crystal shard to Jen, which caused Jen to repair the crystal. I don't like how she was brought back to life. In my opinion, she should have remained dead because she died for the cause. This is definitely a product of the 1980s where you have to have the happy ending, like finding the jewels in your pocket at the end of the Goonies, or getting grand prize at the singing competition in Sister Act 2. So I brought up the all-important prophecy in the aesthetics portion. So what is the all-important prophecy? A Gelfling repairs the crystal to bring the Skeksis and the Mystics, back together to become one. This explains why the Skeksis wiped out all the Gelflings. It was merely an act of self-preservation. And I want to end it off with this. There is a parallel now between the story of Oedipus and this movie. For those that don't know the story of Oedipus, it's a story that goes back to the ancient Greeks. When Oedipus was born, the oracle told his parents that he would kill his father and marry his mother. The parents, acting out of self-preservation, went and abandoned him in the woods. Someone came along, found Oedipus as a baby, and raised him to be their own. Years go by, and Oedipus, as an adult, rides into town and gets to an intersection of 3 roads where he runs into an old man. He and the old man get into an argument of who should go first, and then Oedipus kills the old man after the old man tries to run him over. He then arrives in Thebes and falls in love with an older woman, and they later get married. Then chaos ensues within the civilization. Oedipus sends his uncle to seek the oracle, where it's revealed that the old man he killed on the road was his father, and the woman that he married was his mother. There's a lot more to the story of Oedipus, and I recommend anyone who's interested actually looking up and reading it. So the obvious parallel is that you can't change the prophecy, you can't change destiny, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Now, one last piece of criticism that I just remembered. There is one plot convenience that I feel that cannot be overlooked, and that's after the Podlings are raided by the Skeksis and hauled off into cages for slave labor. Jen and Kira escape. Jen has self-doubt and throws the crystal shard into the distance. The next morning, it just happened to show back up near where Jen and Kira were sleeping that night. So my overall score for the story/plot is 8 out of 10, given that it does have a few problems, but I do think it works overall. Now we move on to the character analysis portion of this retrospective, and for this I am only going to focus on the main characters of the movie, and there's really only 4. You have Jen, who is the hero of our story that is given the task of repairing the Dark Crystal by his mentor before he dies. Jen was raised by the Mystics and doesn't remember anything about his race, which were the Gelflings. He was isolated his whole life but was taught to read and write, book smarts, not street smarts. Then we have Kira, who we meet later on in the story when Jen stumbles into the swamp. She is the other Gelfling in this movie. She was raised by the Podlings and has a recollection of her parents hiding her in the forest while the Skeksis were attacking. So she learned how to live off the land and how to call for other animals to work in her favor. She has street smarts, but not book smarts. Therefore, Jen needs Kira, and Kira needs Jen. They don't really have a power complex like some other characters have in other movies. So with that out of the way, then we get to Aughra, who is the keeper of the secrets that Jen must seek out in the beginning of the movie. Aughra is used primarily to facilitate the hero by having the crystal shard to repair the dark crystal all the way to the observatory, which she can tell when the convergence is going to happen. And then finally is our primary villain of the story, which is Chamberlain. He contests to be the emperor and loses in the trial by stone and gets banished. He goes out into the world to track out Jen to lure him into coming into the castle willingly. He is doing this for one reason and one reason only, and that is to get his robes back, to get back into the society of the Skeksis. So the character analysis, I actually have to give a 9 out of 10 because the characters were very well written and very well executed for a movie like this. Now we're moving into our final section of this retrospective before the final score, and that is the rewatchability of this movie. And in my opinion, there is a lot of reasons to go back and rewatch this movie, but I'm going to keep this section very brief. The plot is very simple, and you'll get everything out of the story the first time you see it. You primarily return to this movie because the world building is so great, from the mythology explained in the very beginning to the traditions that are shown off with the Skeksis and the Podlings. Like I said in the aesthetics portion of this retrospective, this feels like a lived-in world with functioning societies and various economies. The fact that this movie was all puppets and no humans adds to that timeless quality that this movie has. This isn't like Labyrinth, where Jim Henson combines humans with puppets. So as a result, there is no immersion-breaking moment in this movie. Yes, the ending was a product of its time, but this movie has clearly stood the test of time by not only gaining a cult following over the years, but now getting a Netflix series called The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, which I have not seen. So my score for rewatchability is 10 out of 10. Now to end this retrospective off with my personal review score. So with all the math under my new system, the final score that this comes out to is 8.8 out of 10. I did not see this movie until very recently, and I didn't know how much I would actually enjoy it. Originally, I thought about stopping it at the 15-minute mark, and I'm glad that I ignored my gut on this one. I thought you had to be younger in order to really get invested in everything that went on in this movie. I'm 23 right now, and I've been a fan of science fiction fantasy my entire life. This movie does have some issues, as I've stated throughout this episode. If I saw this movie for the first time when I was like 9 or 10 years old, like I did the original Star Wars movie, then I might have liked it more. But because I saw it later in life than most people who saw it, that didn't see it when it first came out, the issues made themselves more known to me, in my opinion. Hey guys, if you liked what you just listened to, then please like and share this across all social media platforms, and subscribe to the channel while you're at it, whether that's on YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion, etc. Make sure to follow MetrObelisk Radio at the social media links in the description, that way you can stay up to date when the newest episodes go up. If you have any topic suggestion for MetrObelisk Radio to cover, then please leave them in the comments. If I use your suggestion for a future episode, I will give you a shout out during that particular episode. With all of that said, have a great day, and I will see you guys next week.